Welcome to the podcast to preserve, protect, and defend the soul of America.
Thank you for having me.
The topic we shall discuss in today's show, the Promise School. Charter education's journey from teacher idealism to market ideology, and what 30 years of evidence actually shows.
It is a massive topic.
It really is. I mean, just imagine a public school system in America literally boarding up its doors.
Right.
Just padlocking the gates and completely shutting down for 5 years.
Unbelievable.
A whole county deciding that, rather than integrate their classrooms, they would simply cease to offer public education at all.
Just leaving an entire generation of kids without formal schooling.
Exactly. And that is not dystopian fiction. That actually happened in Virginia in the late 1950s.
Yeah, Prince Edward County.
Right. And the mechanism that allowed those local leaders to fund private, segregated alternatives for white students was the earliest modern iteration of school choice. Oh, by the way, I'm Alex.
And I am Sam.
Today, we are embarking on a massive, exhaustive exploration of a 30-year educational experiment.
Yeah, we're really digging in today.
We are looking at a mountain of data, historical records, policy documents regarding charter schools to find out what actually works, what fails, and, well, here is the subtitle of today's source material, which is perfect.
Go ahead.
How a labor leader's modest idea became America's most contested experiment in public schooling.
It's quite a journey.
It is. Now, before we jump into the deep end here, we need to set some very clear ground rules for you, the listener.
This is super important.
Because this document covers highly polarized, politically charged terrain.
Very charged.
We're going to be discussing teachers' unions, free market reforms, left-wing viewpoints, and right-wing viewpoints.
The whole spectrum.
So we must explicitly state to you right now that we are strictly neutral guides in this conversation.
Strictly neutral.
We are not taking sides, we are not endorsing the views of the unions, nor are we endorsing the views of the market reformers.
Right. Our sole mission today is to impartially report the factual content.
Exactly. We're just looking at the arguments contained in the source material without endorsing any particular political or ideological stance. We are here strictly to look at the evidence.
Yeah, the goal here is clarity, not advocacy.
Because there's so much noise, right?
Enormous amount of noise, money, and emotion surrounding this topic.
Yeah.
Our job is to synthesize what the actual historical and empirical record shows.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand charter schools, we have to shatter a common misconception right off the bat.
Which is that they're a new idea.
Yes. Americans didn't just invent school choice in the 1990s as some sort of clever policy hack.
Not at all.
We have to go back way further. 150-year historical precedent. Choice in education is the underlying operating system that Americans have been fiercely debating for over a century.
It's baked in from the start.
So listener, ask yourself as we go through this history, is choice inherently a tool for integration to bring diverse people together? Or is it fundamentally a mechanism for exit, a way for groups to separate themselves?
That is the defining question of American public education.
It really is.
And to answer it, the source material takes us all the way back to the 1830s.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, to the common school movement led by reformers like Horace Mann in Massachusetts.
Right.
To understand Mann, you have to picture education back then. It was a chaotic patchwork.
Just a mess.
You had charity schools for the poor, private tutors for the wealthy, and these loosely run local schoolhouses.
And Mann looked at this and thought, how can a democracy survive this?
Exactly. He thought, how do citizens share a baseline civic reality? His vision was actually an argument against choice.
Because he wanted everybody in the same building.
Yes. To forge a common civic culture, he believed you needed a shared, tax-supported, non-sectarian public school. He wanted everyone learning the same civic virtues.
But there was a massive catch to Mann's common school, right?
A huge catch.
Because the schools they built were labeled non-sectarian, meaning they weren't supposed to belong to any specific church.
Right, theoretically.
But in practice, they were heavily, unmistakably Protestant.
Oh, absolutely.
They used the King James Bible. They embedded Protestant moral instruction into the daily lessons.
And this is right when millions of Catholic immigrants are arriving on the East Coast.
Irish immigrants, later Southern and Eastern European immigrants, and they looked at these public schools and realized, this isn't non-sectarian at all.
No, it was actively trying to assimilate their children out of their faith.
So what did they do? They exercised choice.
They did.
Catholic communities, often with very little money, raise pennies to build their own parallel system of parochial schools.
And the political backlash to that choice was incredibly severe.
I mean, we're talking about the Blaine Amendments, right?
Yes, in the 1870s, many states passed these constitutional amendments barring any public funding from flowing to religious schools.
Named after Congressman James G. Blaine.
Right. And the sponsors were not hiding their intentions. They were incredibly candid about their anti-Catholic motivation.
It was a punitive response to Catholic families withdrawing.
It was. And what's wild is that those Blaine amendments are actually still on the books in many state constitutions today.
Which we'll get to later because that completely shapes modern Supreme Court cases.
It really does.
So that's the religious thread. But the deep dive text also points out a much darker racial thread, which brings us back to that vivid image from the top of the show.
Right, the post-1954 era.
After the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Brown v. Board of Education,
Declaring segregated schools unconstitutional.
but the several southern states responded not by integrating, but by funding what they called private segregation academies.
This is where choice was literally weaponized.
Local governments used tuition grants and tax credits to allow white families to withdraw their kids from integrated schools.
And they let the public tax dollars follow those white students out the door.
Which brings us to Prince Edward County, Virginia.
Yes, they took this to the absolute extreme in 1959.
Rather than comply with federal integration orders, they just closed the schools.
Locked the doors for 5 years. They funneled public resources to help white parents establish the private Prince Edward Academy.
And the black children in the county.
Left entirely without formal, locally provided education.
I mean, some had to move to different states to live with relatives just to go to middle school.
Or they just missed 5 years of education entirely. It's a tragedy.
And the text is very careful to state, and again, maintaining strict impartiality here, that this history is not a direct, straight-line ancestor of the modern charter movement.
No, the overwhelming majority of today's charter advocates are advancing a sincerely different project aimed at helping kids in high-poverty districts.
But the text argues we absolutely must understand this history.
Because it explains why the language of choice carries such a complicated, heavy inheritance.
Exactly. When unions and civil rights veterans expressed deep skepticism about voucher programs allowing families to exit the shared system, it didn't just fall out of the sky.
It had very real, traumatic historical grounding. Context is everything.
It is.
But the text also points out, choice hasn't only been used as a tool for exit or segregation.
Right. Fast forward to the 70s and 80s, and choice took on a much more benign form within the public system.
Magnet schools.
Magnet schools. They were specifically developed as a voluntary alternative to court-ordered busing.
The idea was, instead of forcing kids to cross district lines, let's make a school so attractive that families choose to send their kids there.
So they offered specialized curricula, performing arts, advanced science.
And they did this entirely within the traditional public system. The teachers were public employees. Funding stayed in the district.
Right. It was a tool for voluntary integration. But what really set the stage for the modern charter movement was a specific crisis of public confidence in the 80s.
Oh, yes. 1983.
The Reagan administration. The National Commission on Excellence in Education published A Nation at Risk.
That report was an absolute earthquake in American education policy.
It really was.
It was written in this alarming Cold War-era rhetoric. It warned of a rising tide of mediocrity that threatened our future as a nation.
It argued declining test scores were going to destroy our economic prosperity.
But interestingly, the report itself didn't call for free markets or vouchers.
Right. It recommended pragmatic things like more rigorous math and science, better teacher prep.
But the actual policy recommendations almost didn't matter. What mattered was the tone.
It created a nationwide sense of emergency. It painted this picture of a monolithic public school bureaucracy that was failing America.
Which created incredibly fertile ground for radical new ideas to take root.
And the text notes, this is also when homeschooling started growing rapidly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this entire 150-year history of debate flows directly into the modern legal landscape.
How so?
The arguments over public funding and private choice didn't stop in the 80s. Let's look at the 2002 Zelman v. Simmons-Harris decision.
Oh, the Supreme Court case.
Yes. The court upheld Cleveland's voucher program. The logic was that if a government program is completely neutral toward religion on its face, and just routes money to parents.
And then the parents make the genuine choice to spend that public money at a religious school. It doesn't violate the Establishment Clause.
Let's break that down for the listener.
Right, because constitutional law gets dense. The Establishment Clause basically says the government cannot force taxpayer money to fund a church.
But the court essentially said, hey, the government isn't writing a check to the Catholic school. The government is writing a check to the parent.
The parent is acting as a circuit breaker.
Exactly. If the parent hands it to the religious school, that's their private choice,
Yeah.
even though most participating schools in Cleveland were religious.
The parent as the circuit breaker is the perfect analogy.
But the court went even further recently, shifting to the free exercise clause.
Which says the government cannot penalize you for practicing your religion.
Right. In the Espinoza case in 2020 and the Carson case in 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that if a state funds private school tuition, it cannot exclude religious schools just because they are religious.
Because doing so violates the free exercise clause by discriminating against religious families.
Precisely.
So this effectively neuters those anti-Catholic Blaine amendments from the 1870s we talked about.
Yes, those old state laws said no public money for religious schools, period.
And the new ruling says, if you open the door to funding private education at all, you must allow religious schools to step through it.
Which has cleared the legal path for the massive expansion of universal education savings accounts, or ESAs, that we've seen exploding since 2021.
In states like Arizona, Florida, and West Virginia, where parents get a debit card of public funds to spend on private or religious education.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual birth of the charter school.
Yes!
Because out of that 80s panic from a nation at risk, two radically different blueprints emerged.
Two visions that would eventually collide. And this is where we get into the clash of titans. Albert Shanker versus Milton Friedman.
Let's start with Albert Shanker, because his role here is one of the most fascinating ironies.
It really is. To understand Shanker, you have to know he wasn't some free market think tank guy.
No, he was a fierce, militant union labor leader.
He was the president of the American Federation of Teachers for over 2 decades, a man who walked picket lines.
He had actually been arrested and sent to jail for leading an illegal teacher strike in New York City in '68.
The infamous Ocean Hill-Brownsville strike.
And the text notes this was deeply controversial. It pitted the predominantly white and Jewish teachers union against Black and Puerto Rican parents seeking community control.
A very bitter, polarizing moment. But despite that confrontational history, Shanker had this incredible intellectual evolution.
He really did. He believed that teachers were genuine professionals.
Like doctors or lawyers with real professional autonomy, not just assembly line workers taking orders.
Right. He looked at the failing system and said, it's not the teachers who are failing, it's the bureaucratic structure suffocating them.
So in 1988, he outlined his vision for what he called a charter school.
And his vision was incredibly modest.
Very controlled.
He imagined taking a group of, say, 6 or 8 veteran teachers and giving them a charter.
Like a permission slip from the local school district.
Exactly. This charter would free them from rigid scheduling and district mandates. They would create small experimental laboratory schools.
But crucially, these schools would remain entirely within the public system.
Yes, staffed by unionized teachers, racially integrated, and they wouldn't be allowed to cream skim the best students.
So Shanker's dream was like an R&D department for public education.
The whole point was to invent new pedagogies, document what worked, and share it outward.
It was meant to save and strengthen public education from within. And he had a massive platform. He wrote a column in the New York Times for decades.
Because of his advocacy, the very first charter school law was passed in Minnesota in '91.
And it adhered pretty closely to his vision. The schools were public, no tuition, not religious, meant to be laboratories.
But then other states started following Minnesota's lead.
And the laws they passed began to open the door to forces Shanker never intended to invite.
And that brings us to the other tradition, the market tradition, the Milton Friedman vision.
The Nobel Prize-winning economist.
Friedman had been arguing since 1955 that government-run schools were inherently economically inefficient.
He laid out a purely market-driven theory. He conceded the government had a legitimate role in funding education because it benefits society.
But he saw no logical reason why the government had to operate the schools.
Right. He wanted a universal voucher system.
He wanted the government to calculate the per-pupil cost, hand parents a voucher, and let them spend it anywhere.
A traditional public school, private school, religious school, for-profit academy.
His theory was classical economics. Competition for voucher dollars would drive up quality and drive down costs.
Just like any normal consumer market. Bad school goes bankrupt, good school expands.
But there was an immediate and profound critique of this logic, deeply rooted in empirical sociology.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we have to discuss the Coleman Report. Friedman's theory rests on education being a product you consume, like buying a toaster.
Yes, the 1966 federal report by sociologist James Coleman fundamentally challenged that.
It established the vital concept of peer effects.
Right. Coleman found that a student's academic success depends heavily on the socioeconomic makeup and motivation of their classmates.
Peer effects often mattered even more than per pupil spending or the curriculum.
Exactly. Let's make sure we really understand this because it's the crux of the anti-market argument.
Right, if I buy a bad toaster, it doesn't affect the toaster you bought.
We are independent consumers.
But in schools, the product you're experiencing is generated by the other kids in the room.
If you have a classroom full of kids who are well-fed, rested, reading at grade level, the teacher can cover way more material.
But if half the kids are dealing with severe poverty, housing insecurity, trauma, the learning environment is fundamentally different.
Precisely. Therefore, the sociologists argued, if you create a pure Friedman market system, you create a system that sorts children.
Parents with time, resources, and transportation will cluster their kids together in the good schools.
And you inevitably concentrate disadvantage in whichever schools are left behind.
The text notes other market failures, too. Parents often lack reliable comparative info.
And the true value of the product isn't fully valuable until years later when the kid graduates.
Most importantly, the cost of a poor choice falls entirely on children who didn't make the choice themselves.
And American voters inherently understood this risk.
They really did. Through the 80s and 90s, conservatives pushed hard for Friedman-style vouchers.
But every time full voucher programs were put to a direct ballot measure, voters rejected them by massive margins.
True Friedman vouchers were politically unviable.
Which leads to this strategic pivot. When Shanker proposed the charter school concept in '88, market theorists saw an incredible opportunity.
They recognized that if voters wouldn't accept full private school vouchers, charter schools could be the foot in the door.
Because charters were publicly funded, they felt safer to voters.
But they could establish the crucial precedent of public dollars following individual children outside the district bureaucracy.
So Shanker's idea was basically hijacked.
His laboratory of teacher empowerment was adapted into a vehicle for market competition.
The market advocates realized charters could generate evidence that competition works and build a massive political constituency.
Right. If you open enough charters, you have thousands of parents, hundreds of operators, real estate investors, all with a financial stake and expanding choice.
It was a brilliant, highly effective political strategy, and Shanker himself grew deeply alarmed.
Before he died in '97, he publicly warned his modest idea was being mutated.
So how did this foot in the door get kicked wide open into a multi-billion-dollar nationwide industry?
According to the source material, it was a combination of staggering philanthropic wealth and intense bipartisan federal pressure.
Let's break down the philanthropy first. Massive foundation money reshaping public policy.
The Walton Family Foundation became one of the most significant funders in education reform.
Their orientation was unambiguously pro-market, pro-charter, and pro-voucher.
They invested hundreds of millions into advocacy groups and state-level lobbying.
And the text impartially notes the labor context here. The Waltons had a long history of opposing unions in their retail business.
So weakening the political power of teachers' unions was seen by many as a primary objective.
Then you have the Broad Foundation, created by Eli Broad. They brought a distinctly corporate management philosophy.
They wanted to treat a city school district like a financial portfolio of assets.
You close the underperforming assets, expand the successful ones, and replace career educators with business executives.
And behind them you had the Arnold Foundation, Gates Foundation, Dell Foundation. It created an unprecedented infrastructure of private money.
But it wasn't just private money. The federal government played a coercive role, and the text emphasizes this was entirely bipartisan.
In 2001, you had the No Child Left Behind Act, championed by Republican George W. Bush, but heavily supported by Democrat Ted Kennedy.
NCLB mandated strict standardized testing. And if schools failed to make adequate yearly progress, they had to offer students the option to transfer or use federal funds for tutoring.
This legally embedded the logic of choice directly into federal law.
And then came the Obama administration, which took the Bush framework and poured lighter fluid on it with Race to the Top in 2009.
States were desperate for cash after the financial crisis, and Obama dangled a $4.35 billion pool of competitive federal grants.
But to be eligible, states had to prove they were adopting specific reforms, including explicitly removing state caps on how many charter schools could open.
Obama's education secretary, Arne Duncan, was a passionate champion.
The text notes Duncan genuinely believed the traditional system was catastrophically failing marginalized children.
But the financial incentives caused a nationwide surge. States rushed to lift caps to get the money, often failing to build regulatory guardrails.
Now, we promised our listeners a strictly impartial look at the evidence, and the source material dedicates significant space to outlining the absolute strongest arguments for the charter movement.
Yes, the evidence for choice is not frivolous.
Let's look at the autonomy argument. In 1990, John Chubb and Terry Moe published a highly influential book.
They looked at datasets and argued the most consistent predictor of a school's effectiveness is organizational autonomy.
They argued traditional public schools are bogged down by school board politics, state mandates, collective bargaining agreements.
Charters, by definition, have more autonomy to hire, fire, extend the school day, change curriculum.
Ironically, that's the exact argument Shanker was making. They just drew an anti-union conclusion from it.
The deep dive text also steps outside the U.S. to show this debate globally. Let's look at Sweden.
In '92, Sweden allowed public money to follow students to any school, including for-profits.
The result: massive grade inflation, because schools were competing for customers by handing out easy A's and severe social sorting.
Then Chile, under Pinochet. A radical national voucher system led to decades of intense public protest over massive inequities.
But then the text points us to the Netherlands.
Right. They've funded private, religious, and public schools on equal terms since 1917.
It is a highly chosen, highly diverse system, and it is incredibly peaceful and successful.
Proving that choice isn't inherently good or evil. The design details and regulatory apparatus matter far more than abstract economic theory.
Bringing it back to the U.S., we impartially present the civil rights case for charters because it is deeply felt on the ground.
Surveys consistently show that a substantial majority of Black parents in areas with failing urban schools fiercely support charter schools.
When a network like Success Academy in New York City opens a school in a low-income neighborhood, they have massive waiting lists.
They literally have to run admission lotteries and auditoriums because the demand from working-class Black and Latino parents is so intense.
The source material is clear. Dismissing this parental demand as false consciousness is deeply unfair.
These parents are making urgent, rational judgments for their children in a system that has historically failed them.
And on the flip side, we must acknowledge the critique of teachers' unions.
The text points out that in some urban districts, collective bargaining agreements genuinely made it nearly impossible to dismiss ineffective teachers.
You had the rubber rooms in New York, where accused teachers sat for years collecting salary.
Union contracts mandated assignments based on seniority and resisted differentiated pay for teachers at tougher schools.
Pointing out that a rigid worker protection system doesn't automatically serve the most vulnerable kids is a documented empirical reality the reformers highlighted.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
What happens when we look at the absolute best, most rigorous mathematical data on charter school performance?
The Boston Miracle.
Yes, the research from Boston is the absolute gold standard in education economics.
Because it uses a lottery-based design. MIT economists, including Joshua Angrist, realized they had a unique opportunity.
Because the best charters in Boston were oversubscribed, they had to admit students via random lottery. Let me stop you there, because the mechanics of this study are brilliant.
Explain why it matters.
In most research, you have selection bias. If you compare a charter's test scores to a public school, critics will say the charter only has kids whose parents cared enough to apply.
You're comparing highly motivated families to average families, apples to oranges.
Exactly. The selection bias ruins the data, but the lottery fixes that mathematically.
Because the researchers looked only at the pool of students who applied. Every single kid in that pool had motivated parents.
Then a random computer lottery split that pool in half.
They compared the kids who won the lottery and attended the charter against the kids who lost and went to the public school.
It perfectly isolates the effect of the school itself and the results.
Undeniable, mathematically massive achievement gains for disadvantaged students in Boston charters, particularly in math.
The effects are so large, Very few serious researchers even dispute them.
We see similar findings in New York City and Denver. It's conclusive proof that under the right conditions, well-run charters produce transformative gains.
But Sam, I have to jump in and challenge this narrative a bit. Can we actually scale the Boston miracle?
That's the big question.
Because Boston is a very specific ecosystem. Strict authorizers, high per pupil funding, a massive pipeline of elite college grads from Harvard and MIT who want to teach for a few years.
Is it a scalable blueprint or dependent on localized conditions?
Right. So what does the national data tell us over 30 years?
For the national picture, the source material turns to the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford University. CIRIO uses a massive matched sample methodology.
They take a charter student and find their virtual twin in a public school matched on race, poverty, test scores, and track them.
Their first major national study in 2009 was a cold shower.
A very cold shower. It blew up the narrative that charters were inherently better. The data showed only 17% of charter schools produced significantly better results.
46% were exactly the same as public schools.
And a staggering 37% were significantly worse.
It showed enormous variance. The best were incredible, the worst were abysmal, the median was a wash.
But in follow-up studies in 2013 and 2023, we see clear sector maturation.
Yes. The 2023 study found charter students gained roughly 23 additional days of learning per year in reading and 37 in math.
So the sector improved over a 15-year period. Why? Did they magically figure out a better way to teach?
Not exactly. The improvement happened largely because of the ruthless market mechanism Friedman predicted.
The worst performing schools were shut down, and the best ones like KPP or Success Academy expanded.
The market was winnowing out the failures.
But wait, a 15-year market correction is an eternity in the life of a child.
It really is.
An entire generation of kids went from kindergarten to high school, trapped in those failing charters, just to serve as friction for the market to adjust.
How is that a defense of the Friedman model?
Do you have 15 years to wait for the invisible hand to close a bad school while your 7-year-old needs to learn to read today?
That is exactly the profound friction the text highlights. The collateral damage of market adjustment falls on real children.
And we have to examine the cost of that success at the high-performing networks that survived.
Networks like KPP and Success Academy rely heavily on what is called a no-excuses model.
Explain what no excuses looks like on the ground.
Highly regimented, intensely disciplined environments, longer school days, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m.
Longer school years cutting into the summer.
Silent hallways.
Yeah.
Uniforms. Incredibly high behavioral expectations, where minor infractions like not tracking the teacher with your eyes can result in demerits.
They produce miraculous test scores, but they also have astonishingly high attrition rates.
The text notes between 15 and 60% of entering students leave these no-excuses charters before completing the program.
And who are the kids leaving? Disproportionately kids with behavioral challenges, severe trauma, or special education needs.
The discipline structure essentially acts as a centrifuge, spitting out the kids who can't conform.
Which raises a massive data question. If a traditional public school pushed out 40% of its highest need kids and kept only the most resilient subset, we'd call it a scandal.
But in the charter sector, when those remaining kids ace the tests, it makes the data look miraculous.
It profoundly complicates the narrative. What would those scores look like if they had to educate the entire community?
Let's take these macro-level trends and look at extreme real-world scenarios. A tale of two cities, Michigan versus New Orleans.
What happens when regulatory guardrails are entirely removed versus when a system is completely rebuilt from scratch?
Let's start with Michigan, specifically Detroit, which the text describes as the absolute Wild West of charter schooling.
Michigan passed its law in '93, driven by conservative lawmakers and the DeVos family.
Designed to maximize expansion and minimize oversight, they allowed multiple entities to authorize charter schools.
Local districts, state universities, community colleges, why is that a problem?
It created a free market for authorizers. It led to a race to the bottom.
Because if an authorizer was too strict, the charter operator would just shop around and find a more lenient university.
Right, and the universities were collecting administrative fees for the schools they chartered.
So they were taking a percentage of public funding as a fee, generating recurring revenue for their own budgets.
They had a direct financial incentive to keep failing charter schools open, because if they closed them, they lost the revenue stream.
A structural conflict of interest, and unlike almost every other state, Michigan permitted for-profit companies to manage these schools.
Roughly 80% of Michigan's charters were run by for-profit education management organizations, or EOs.
Taking 10 to 20% of the per-pupil funding right off the top as a management fee.
Taxpayer money meant for textbooks going to corporate profit margins.
And their profit depended on maximizing enrollment while minimizing operational costs, paying teachers less, providing fewer services.
Especially because many of these companies also owned the real estate the school was leasing, engaging in self-dealing lease agreements.
And all this unregulated chaos descended on Detroit when it was bleeding population and hurtling toward municipal bankruptcy.
Over 100 charter schools popped up in strip malls, competing viciously.
A 2016 investigation by Kate Zernike in the New York Times documented a glut of underfunded, chronically underperforming schools.
But again, maintaining strict impartiality. We must present the conservative pushback to that reporting.
Right. Researchers like J.P. Green and the Cato Institute pointed out that when you look at the Sirido matched sample data for those years,
Detroit's charter sector was actually performing slightly better than Detroit's traditional public schools.
so who is right? The text says both can be true. Yes, charters perform slightly better.
But Detroit's traditional public schools were scoring at the absolute rock bottom of national assessments.
Being slightly less bad than a bankrupt system is a different claim from saying the unregulated free market was a success.
What's fascinating here is how the unregulated market dynamics played out regarding special education.
Right, because special ed is incredibly expensive. Physical therapy, one-on-one aid.
In Michigan's for-profit environment, management companies had a financial incentive to avoid enrolling high-needs students.
State investigations found patterns of counseling out administrators subtly discouraging enrollment, saying we just don't have the resources to serve your child.
And what happens then? The traditional public school system becomes the underfunded default provider for the most expensive, highest needs students.
While the regular funding for easier-to-teach kids follows them to the for-profit charters.
That dynamic drains the district regardless of test scores. Now, let's contrast the chaos of Detroit with New Orleans.
After the absolute devastation of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the state-run Recovery School District effectively dissolved the public school system.
They fired the teachers and rebuilt from scratch as a charter market. By the mid-2010s, virtually every student attended a charter school.
But they didn't just throw the doors open to a Wild West free-for-all.
No, they brought in massive philanthropic capital, recruited elite national networks, and instituted fierce accountability. If a charter failed, the state shut it down.
Did it work?
Analyses led by Douglas Harris at Tulane University showed genuine, undeniable academic gains compared to pre-Katrina levels.
Test scores went up, graduation rates went up.
But those gains came with massive coordination chaos early on. Because every school was an independent operator, parents had to navigate dozens of different application processes.
An absolute nightmare for families with the fewest resources, treating enrollment like a full-time job.
So what did New Orleans do? They invented a centralized lottery system called the One App.
Parents fill out one form, an algorithm sorts the kids fairly.
They had to create a massive central bureaucracy to manage expulsions, special ed, and busing.
They essentially had to recreate the administrative functions of a traditional school district just to make the free market function.
The lesson is profound. Markets left entirely to themselves, like Detroit, fail marginalized populations because profit motives exploit vulnerability.
But markets heavily managed and centrally coordinated, like New Orleans, can succeed.
But as the text cautions, New Orleans required a catastrophic institutional collapse and unrepeatable influx of outside capital.
We've talked a lot about structural economics. The source material moves us into the intense human and political realities on the ground.
Let's talk about Betsy DeVos. She embodies the intersection of ideological market fundamentalism and vast wealth.
Long before she was Trump's Secretary of Education, her family spent 30 years reshaping politics in Michigan.
She led a massive ballot campaign in the year 2000 to amend the Michigan Constitution to allow publicly funded vouchers for private and religious schools.
The purest expression of the Friedman dream put to the voters, and they rejected it by a massive margin, roughly 69 to 31%.
But that defeat didn't stop them. It just redirected their strategy.
They shifted to legislative lobbying and aggressive candidate recruitment. DeVos founded the American Federation for Children,
Pushing for what critics call stealth vouchers or tax credit scholarships.
We need to explain this because it's politically brilliant. A donor gives $10,000 to a nonprofit scholarship granting organization.
In return, the state gives that donor a $10,000 for dollar credit on their state taxes.
And that nonprofit gives the money as a scholarship for a private religious school.
It's basically a money laundering mechanism for public funds. Because it's technically a private charitable contribution flowing through a nonprofit, it avoids constitutional scrutiny.
But the fiscal effect is identical. The state loses $10,000 in tax revenue, and the private school gains $10,000.
Her tenure as Secretary of Education was highly polarized, but her long-term state-level project has been wildly successful recently with the explosion of those universal ESAs.
But beyond the billionaire politics, we also have to examine the racial dynamics on the ground, which are deeply fraught.
The civil rights argument for charters is based on the reality that the public school system systematically underserved Black and Latino children for generations.
The parents seeking charters are desperate for better options.
But the sociological reality of enrollment is complex. Studies repeatedly show charters in major cities disproportionately enroll Black and Latino students from slightly more stable family circumstances.
Right. Kids from two-parent households or slightly higher incomes within that demographic.
Meanwhile, they under-enroll children experiencing homelessness, foster youth, and students with severe disabilities.
Because it creates a sorting effect. The enrollment process requires active participation.
It requires a parent who has the time to research, apply, persist on a wait list, attend orientations.
The result is the charter market serves the somewhat less disadvantaged among the disadvantaged.
It skims the most motivated families off the top, while concentrating the highest need students in the traditional public system.
The charter system acts as an exit option for working-class Black and Latino families, which has immense value for those families.
But mathematically, it inadvertently drains resources and peer role models from the kids left behind. It creates a new tier of inequity within marginalized communities.
And then we cannot forget the teachers in all of this. We started with Shanker's dream of teacher empowerment.
But the reality in many high-performing no-excuses charters is grueling. 8 or 9 hour instructional days, mandatory evening cell phone availability.
Relentless data review sessions. The result is a 30 to 50% annual teacher turnover rate.
A third to a half of the teaching staff brand new every single year.
Think about what that means for a fourth grader. Every 2 years, half the adults they trust vanish.
No veteran teachers to mentor the brand new grads.
So, what does this all mean? If a school's operational model relies on recruiting fresh 23-year-old teachers, burning them out with 70-hour mix, and replacing them before they demand higher pay, is that sustainable or just an extraction machine?
Gig economy schooling. High turnover destroys institutional knowledge.
And ironically, the vast majority of the charter sector operates completely non-union.
But traditional public school teachers remain a formidable political force. The 2018 Red for Ed strikes showed labor's enduring power can still shut down states and block voucher expansions.
Which brings us to the crucial question. Where do we go from here? After 30 years, what are the evidence-based rules for building a good choice system?
The text gives us 5 specific policy mandates based on where charters actually succeed, like Massachusetts.
Rule 1, not-for-profit management only.
Introducing a profit motive into a system with fixed per-pupil revenue structurally incentivizes cutting educational costs at the expense of students.
Rule 2, single-purpose independent authorizers.
Michigan showed us that allowing multiple authorizers to compete creates a race to the bottom. The authority to grant a charter needs to be concentrated in a well-resourced, independent state body.
Rule 3, strict anti-cream skimming enrollment laws.
Charters must be legally required to enroll disabled, English language learning, and homeless students at proportionate rates. And centralized lotteries like One App should be the standard.
Rule 4, total financial transparency.
Mandatory independent appraisals for real estate leases to prevent self-dealing. A school receiving taxpayer money shouldn't hide its books behind a private business structure.
And Rule 5, which returns to Shanker's original dream. Accountability should be based on a school's specific charter mission, not just standardized test scores.
If a school is chartered to serve high school dropouts, evaluate them on that. Forcing every experimental school to compete on the exact same narrow metric defeats the purpose of innovation.
But taking a step back from the policy weeds, the source material asks a profound democratic question.
Removing schools from the oversight of publicly elected school boards and putting them in private management shifts accountability.
Accountability moves from citizens voting at a ballot box to consumers voting with their feet.
And we must remind the listener that both systems are incredibly vulnerable to capture.
Traditional democratic school boards have absolutely been captured by special interests, union endorsements, vendor contracts.
But the free market is equally vulnerable to capture by well-capitalized management corporations who view students as revenue units.
There is no autopilot for good schools. Both require exhausting, continuous public oversight.
It is the hard work of democracy.
It is. And as we wrap up this incredibly dense deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought.
The new frontier of educational choice isn't even charter schools anymore. It's pandemic pods, microschools, and universal ESAs.
We're talking about unregulated groups of 5 or 10 kids meeting in a living room entirely funded by tax dollars with zero state oversight on what they're being taught.
It's the ultimate realization of the exit option. Choice stripped of almost all public accountability.
Exactly. So mull this over. If education becomes hyper-individualized and entirely privatized into these tiny microgroups where conservative kids learn one history, liberal kids learn another, religious kids learn a third, what happens to the concept of a shared civic reality?
Does absolute unregulated choice fundamentally dissolve the common in the American commons school that Horseman envisioned?
If we aren't learning together, if we don't share a baseline set of facts and civic values, how do we live together in a functioning democracy? Is choice a tool for integration or the ultimate mechanism for exit?
That is the vital existential question for the next 30 years. Now, before we sign off, we absolutely must explicitly discuss where all of these brilliant insights and historical analyses came from today.
Yes, you might be wondering, why on earth is a 30-year exhaustive history of charter schools and educational policy sitting inside a book with the title we are about to give you?
Right, it seems like a pivot, but it's not.
It's because the author's overarching thesis is that to truly understand the collapse of American civic infrastructure, you first have to understand how we dismantled our shared public institutions.
And there is no public institution more foundational than the schoolhouse.
This entire conversation is derived directly from the second book of the 30-volume series, To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America, specifically the book titled Volume 2, Fentanyl Nation, Inside America's Opioid Catastrophe, authored by Sue B. Howell.
It is a profoundly detailed and rigorously researched piece of work that connects our civic institutions to our public health crises in regulatory ways. And the book is now available in all Amazon bookstores across the world.
We enthusiastically encourage all of you listening to go check out the book, buy it, read it, and please leave comments and feedback on the Amazon page.
The discussions happening around this 30-volume series are incredible, and we want you to be a part of it. It has been an absolute privilege to unpack this dense history with you today.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep asking the hard questions, and we will see you next time.